Welcome back to Mad Medicine. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing part 2 of our hypoxia lecture series. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you check it out. And with that being said, let's go ahead, let's quickly review hypoxia, and then we're going to talk about two other causes of hypoxia that we did not cover in part 1. So, hypoxia is a condition in the body or part of the body where you do not have enough oxygen at the tissue level. Enough oxygen is not being delivered to the tissues. And when that happens, your tissues are going to go in a state of oxygen deprivation. Now, our tissues are very important. Our tissues are very dependent on oxygen because oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. And if you have oxygen, you are going to be able to generate ATP. Okay, but if you lack oxygen, you're going to have impaired oxidative phosphorylation, which essentially means you're not going to be forming ATP. So the TLDR, the gist of this whole, this whole bullet point section is that if you have low oxygen, you are going to have low ATP, and if you have low ATP, essentially you will die. Okay, pretty straightforward. That's why hypoxia is so dangerous. That's why we want to treat hypoxia. So what are the causes of hypoxia? The first one is ischemia, which we discussed in part 1. Okay, so go check out that video of hypoxia part 1. And then the other two causes, which we're going to discuss right now, are hypoxemia and the decreased oxygen carrying capacity that can also lead to hypoxia. So with that being said, these two topics are going to be very high yield. These are going to be high yield AF. These are things you need to understand very well, and you need to commit to the back of your mind. Do not forget them. Let's talk about hypoxemia. So, hypoxemia is a condition where you have abnormally low levels of oxygen in the blood. That is very important, okay? You have low levels of oxygen in the blood. Now, I want to write this so you understand. Hypoxia has to do with decreased O2 at the tissue level, okay? So, this is very broad. In hypoxia, you can also have hypoxemia, which is occurring essentially at the blood level. So decreased O2 in the blood. Okay? Very easy to get these two confused, but very important to understand why they're different. Hypoxia is more broad than hypoxemia. So how do you classify someone being hypoxemic? Essentially, you're going to look at the partial pressure of oxygen. And in hypoxemic patients, their partial pressure of oxygen is going to be low. So a normal PaO2, or the partial pressure of oxygen, is between 75 to 105 millimeters of mercury. In hypoxemic patients, their PaO2 is going to be less than 60, and their SA, or the saturation, oxygen saturation, is going to be less than 90%. Now, you might have forgotten these basic concepts, so I'm going to give you a quick review of these, weird terminologies that you're seeing. So let's review how oxygen gets into our body. Essentially, you have O2 in the atmosphere, okay? And what it's going to do, it's going to go into our lungs, okay? From our lungs, it's going to go into our alveoli, okay? And then from our alveoli, it's going to go into our blood, and then from the blood, it's going to bind to hemoglobin. Okay, so this is very important because at each of these stages, we can actually measure how much oxygen we have. So how do we do it? It's by different values. So this is the pathway you need to remember. FiO2 to P big AO2 to P little AO2 to SaO2. Okay, FiO2 is a the fractional inspired oxygen. All right, what that means is that this is the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Right here, the very first step, the oxygen in the atmosphere. This is FiO2. Then you have P big AO2, okay? This is the amount of oxygen, essentially, or the partial pressure of oxygen in your alveoli, in your alveolar space. Right here, this is P big AO2. Then you have P little AO2. This is the partial pressure of oxygen in your arterioles, or your blood. That's how I classified it. Okay, so this is P little AO2 in your arteries, or the arterioles, the smallest of the arteries. And then you have finally SaO2, or the oxygen saturation. This is the amount of oxygen that is really in your blood, or which is bound to the hemoglobin, so SaO2. All right, then this is also what you are going to be seeing on the monitor as 90%, 99%, 70%, etc., etc. That is what you're talking about. So if you're thinking about the pathway of how oxygen goes into our blood and gets delivered to our tissues, remember this simple drawing, simple concept. So this is hypoxemia. Hypoxemia is essentially low oxygen in the blood. It is very low oxygen in the blood. And what are the two main things that measure oxygen in the blood? It's P little AO2 and oxygen saturation, or SaO2. That means hypoxemic patients are going to have low values for both PaO2 and SaO2, as you can see right here. Very, very simple, very straightforward. If you need to get this more solidified in your brain, spend some time with it, understand it, get a better understanding of it, and then move on. So, what can cause hypoxemia? What can cause low oxygen levels in your blood? Essentially, it goes through the whole pathway system of how oxygen gets in the blood. Let's talk about the first thing, the atmosphere. Where in, the world are you going to have less oxygen in the air? High altitude. High altitude is going to lead to hypoxemia because you are disrupting this pathway, this structure right here. Because you are disrupting this structure, this whole pathway right here, okay, you are going to have problems in the in the blood, right? So in high altitude, you have low FiO2. If you have low FiO2, okay, you are going to have low P big AO2, because you're not going to have enough oxygen being delivered to the arteria or to the alveoli, which means you will have low P little AO2 and you will have low SaO2, oxygen saturation. Therefore, you are going to have low amounts of PaO2, SaO2, and you are going to be hypoxemic. So that's one thing. Well, what else can you block? Essentially, let's talk about our alveoli. Let's talk about what else can cause difficulty in getting oxygen in our alveoli. The next step of the pathway, that would be carbon dioxide buildup. In carbon dioxide buildup, aka hypoventilation or COPD, you are going to have an increase in PaCO2. Okay, not PaO2, but PaCO2. And when carbon dioxide goes up, you are going to have a decrease in PaO2. So even though FiO2 in this condition could be perfectly fine, could be normal, P big AO2 is going to be low, which means you are going to have low arterial oxygen saturation, or partial pressure of oxygen in the arterioles, and you are going to have low oxygen saturation in the bloodstream, which means you will have low oxygen, and which means you will be hypoxemic. So that can cause it as well. But remember, partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is inversely related to the partial pressure of partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is inversely related to the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. So if carbon dioxide goes up, oxygen has to go down. Very simple, very straightforward, because it has to do with how our lungs function and how we breathe. And then finally, what can affect oxygen at the blood level, at the arterial level? Essentially, it is going to be the difficulty of oxygen going from our alveoli to our blood. What is in between the alveoli and the blood? It is our alveolar membranes. Well, what can cause the interstitial area and the alveolar membrane to be harder for oxygen to diffuse through? Interstitial lung disease. So in interstitial lung disease, you are affecting P little AO2, or the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterioles. When P little AO2, or the arterial oxygen, goes down, you are going to have low oxygen saturation in the bloodstream, hence you will be hypoxemic. This is the basic concept of hypoxemia. You need to understand it to get a good understanding of hypoxia. Okay, so very, very high yield, very important you understand it. Make sure you understand how oxygen really gets into our bloodstream. It's very straightforward, very intuitive, but people often forget. And make sure you understand this right here. I know I have a lot of writing on the screen right now, but make sure you understand this pathway. FiO2 to P big AO2 to P little AO2 to SaO2 saturation. Okay, so we talked about hypoxemia. If you need to take a break right now, get some water, because we're about to move on to oxygen carrying capacity. This is also a very high yield topic, something you need to understand really well in order to get what hypoxia is, to get a broad understanding of hypoxia. So we're going to dive in and we're going to talk about oxygen carrying capacity. So oxygen is carried in our blood via red blood cells and hemoglobin. Mainly, it has to do with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is very important because it is essentially a molecule, a protein that allows our body to carry how many oxygen molecules? 4. You have 4 oxygen molecules that can bind to hemoglobin, right? So when can you get a decrease in the oxygen carrying capacity? Essentially, it's going to happen when you have something interrupting hemoglobin or hemoglobin's ability to bind. That is very important. So the first thing that interrupts hemoglobin is going to be anemia. Anemia essentially is a condition where you have decreased red blood cell mass, or essentially you don't have enough red blood cells. When you don't have enough red blood cells, you are not going to have enough hemoglobin. So decrease in red blood cells means you are going to have a decrease in hemoglobin. And if you have decrease in hemoglobin, you are going to have a decrease in the oxygen carrying capacity. Okay, and if you have a decrease in the oxygen carrying capacity, then you are not going to be able to perfuse the body. You are going to become hypoxemic and the tissue will end up dying. Okay, so that means decrease carrying capacity. So oxygen carrying capacity. So that's one way you can interrupt hemoglobin. But there are 2 more ways that you need to understand and you need to commit to the back of your mind. The first one is carbon monoxide, especially carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide is a very, very strong hemoglobin binder. When it binds to hemoglobin, it is going to displace the oxygen from being bound to the hemoglobin. It is so strong that it pushes oxygen off. Now, this is the important thing you need to understand. In carbon monoxide poisoning, you are going to have a normal PaO2. The arterial oxygen amount is going to be fine because in the bloodstream, okay, this is your artery, whatever. In your artery, your oxygen content is going to be normal because there's nothing interrupting oxygen entering into the blood. The alveolar membrane, there's no interstitial lung disease, etc., etc. It's fine. Everything is fine. But at the hemoglobin level, which is really looking at SaO2 or the oxygen saturation, you are not able to bind oxygen because you have carbon monoxide bound to this. So when oxygen binds to it, it doesn't really successfully bind. It gets kicked off because of the carbon monoxide. And that means you are going to have a normal PaO2, but the saturation is going to be decreased. So how can you get carbon monoxide poisoning? How can you get it? Pretty straightforward. Think about gas heaters in the winter. Think about smoke from a fire or a car exhaust, okay? If you are in a closed, non-ventilated space with a car running, you will get carbon monoxide poisoning, and that can lead to death because you become hypoxic, and that leads to tissue necrosis and death overall, okay? Because you don't have enough ATP. Very straightforward. So the classic presentation, this is pretty high yield for your exams, is going to be someone with cherry red appearance. The reason why this is very important is because this is a false physical presentation. If you look at their face, they're not going to be, they're not going to have blue lips. They're not going to seem like they are hypoxic. And that's because their PaO2 is normal. This is the reason why it's false. But they're actually not getting enough oxygen to the tissues because hemoglobin is not binding oxygen, and therefore they are still hypoxic. They're going to have cherry red appearance of the skin, of the lips, but they're going to have low oxygen saturation levels, all because of the fact that they have carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, something else might include you to this. Maybe they're, in a house because it's really cold. They've been sitting near a gas heater for a long time. Maybe there was a fire that they're coming in for burns as well, or they tried to commit suicide due to a car exhaust. Whatever it may be, might clue you into it. Oftentimes, the cherry red appearance is not the first thing you're going to see. This is sometimes a false representation. You might not even be given this. What you might be given is a headache. So if they present with these things in the vignette where they're near a heater or a fire or a car exhaust, but they have a headache, their lip is still normal, it's not blue, it's not cherry red, but they have a headache, you need to think about carbon monoxide poisoning. Very freaking high yield, very important. Do not forget this. commit this to your memory. So that's one of the three, that's one of the two main conditions you need to know other than anemia. The other one you need to know is methemoglobin. Methemoglobin occurs when the iron molecule Fe3 plus is Fe2 plus is oxidized to Fe3 plus. This is not normal. In hemoglobin, you have iron in the middle, in the center of the hemoglobin, and normally it is this Fe2 plus form, right? But when it becomes oxidized because of being exposed to oxidative stress, it can become Fe3 plus, and this is very dangerous. Essentially, this makes oxygen binding to the hemoglobin much harder. It requires a lot. It requires harder. Or it requires more oxygen to bind at the same level. Okay, so what happens in this condition? You're going to have a normal PaO2 but a decreased SaO2, same situation, and this usually is going to happen because of oxidative stress occurring. So like nitrates, sulfa drugs, even benzocaine or lidocaine, which are topical, or there's a numbing agents that can be used during a dental appointment, they can lead to methemoglobin. So one classic presentation might be someone who came in because they went to the dentist and now they're feeling hypoxia, they're not able to breathe, their oxygen saturation is really low. So what's going on? Well, it might be because the hemoglobin has an iron that's become oxidized to Fe3 plus, making oxygen harder to bind to the hemoglobin, meaning oxygen is not being delivered. Pretty straightforward. Another classic presentation would be cyanosis, right? Someone who's going to have blue lips, but also chocolate colored blood. This is essentially pathognomonic for methemoglobinemia. Okay, pathognomonic, methem. There you go. Okay, so the treatment for this is something you need to understand. Treatment is very straightforward, and I'm going to give you a way to remember this. For methemoglobin is methylene blue and ancillary treatment with vitamin C. The reason why we give them this is because it helps reduce Fe3 plus back to the Fe2 plus, and it allows you to be able to start binding oxygen to your hemoglobin. How do you remember this? Essentially, I would remember methemoglobin with methylene blue. Okay, so meth goes with meth. Pretty straightforward. That's how I always remembered it. And blue because they're going to be cyanotic. So methylene blue with hemoglobin, with methemoglobinemia. So let's review hypoxia really quickly. Hypoxia can be caused by ischemia, can be caused by hypoxemia, and can be caused by low oxygen carrying capacity. When it comes to ischemia, you can have decreased oxygen going to the tissues, meaning this is arterial blockade. You can have decreased oxygen going from the tissues, which is a venous blockade, or you can have shock. In hypoxemia, you can have decreased oxygen in the atmosphere. Remember, we're dealing with FiO2. You can have decreased oxygen, you can have increased oxygen, carbon dioxide buildup, which means you have decrease in P big AO2, or you can have decreased oxygen transportation, which essentially is decrease in P little AO2. All right, and then in carrying capacity problems, you have anemia, carbon monoxide, and methemoglobinemia. So I hope this was helpful. I really recommend you watch this again. If you don't get everything, if you don't understand it, make sure you have a good grasp of hypoxia as a whole, including hypoxemia and decreased oxygen carrying capacity and how it relates to hypoxia. Very, very important, very high yield. I hope you found this video educational and helpful. If you did, consider subscribing to our channel because your support really means a lot to us. If you like this content and you want to see more content like this, go to our website at www.madmedicine.org, where you can find more educational content for your exam prep free of charge. Thank you.